All right, let's check the levels here. Excellent. Okay, so hopefully you can all hear me pretty well. Mic was maybe a little bit quiet last time, so just let me know if it's difficult to hear and I'll tweak it. But otherwise, welcome back to the Thursday concept stream. We're going to continue on with the environment piece that we were working on last week, the stylized piece. We got pretty far with it in terms of kind of laying out some of the larger forms in there. So we're going to continue with some of the texture development. I'll show you sort of, I roughed out some lighting on it to try and get a sense of what it might look like. So we'll just go through that stuff. So let's make that switch over to the stream of my Cintiq and get going, get into it here. Okay, so we're looking at the piece here. I'll just make sure I shift my canvas out of the way a little bit of the camera. And I'll get back there. Something like that. There we go. Okay, so what we're looking at here today is I did a few things to kind of start to set the mood in the piece. A little kind of sketching of the trees in there. I'm definitely going to come back in there and make those trees a lot more, I guess, hard-edged and bring the texture out a little bit more. I just wanted to see what that texture might start to feel like. I do have, I have added a few things in here, so let's just undo those. So this is what we kind of ended up with last week. And this week, I wanted to get into kind of making this feel a lot less kind of like bright in our face. The nice way, or the nice thing about this at this point, good morning, is that we have those base layers that we can start to comp in lighting and other effects, colorization layers and whatnot on top. So this first layer I have here is a multiply. I just wanted to kind of dim it down a little bit because it's kind of the lighter values screaming in our face, right? And I wanted it to feel a bit more moody, like a reference. Okay, so I get it down into that level. I mean, we can always play with how much of that's coming through in there. I wanted it to be pretty dark and a little bit more moody. So I had that in there, and then I just used a mask to start to actually sketch in with where the lighting might be hitting certain things. Now, being that this is all on one layer, I'm going to have to go back through and actually apply that to a whole bunch of the other layers, right? But I can just kind of comp that in here. If you see, if I disable the layer mask, this is sort of what the overall effect is. And by using that mask and editing in the mask, I can start to bring it back out to this full brightness, right? So that's how I achieve that look. And I'm pretty happy with that. I mean, by the end, I might see something a little bit different in there in terms of the evolution of the piece with the lighting, but that's a good layer to kind of leave up on top to have that that first impression of our lighting on the scene. Yes, the masks. The masks are super fun, especially if you're a student of mine or have been. I talk about the usefulness of masks all the time. It used to be something that I was pretty afraid of, like early on in my career, because I didn't understand what it actually was, which is kind of funny because it's not that bad, right? It's actually fairly simple and very useful in terms of not destroying the pixels that you may have laid down. And you can always change it later, right? Fix it, tweak it, whatever you want to do. So yes, masks again. Drinking the coffee today. It's fun as time goes on. Yeah, it can be. It definitely can be. I think the fun comes from the fact that you can get the effect and still have the ability of bringing that artwork back out if you feel like, maybe I went too far with something or I want to try something else. It's always just there to fix, right? So, yeah, I haven't changed much at all, right? It's like one layer. I put another layer up in here. Let's get in the habit of naming our layers. Another multiply layer here. And that's just an empty layer, so we can get rid of it. And then at the top, I had a hue saturation where I changed everything to be really saturated and masked everything out, just so it was this little spot where that light hits down on the grass down below to kind of draw the viewer's eye. That's something of a target or a goal that I want to have by the end of the piece. And so all of this stuff can be throw that all in a group, and we'll call it maybe VTAR, and that's short for visual target. And so we can always just build up things in the visual target layer to see how things go. Yeah. As fun as sternocleidomastoid. Yeah, my favorite word for the neck muscles in here. Yeah, that's it's funny you remember that. I guess I've been saying that for years now, but yeah, it's as fun as that. Okay, so let us get into some of the actual tweaking of this stuff. So one of the things that you'll see, especially if you're looking at the artwork of someone like Ivan Earl of Disney fame, early days of Disney, when he produces his work, there's generally a texture that he uses. And so you can Google Ivan Earl. I'll type that in the chat. And you can start to see this simplification of landscapes, making those really basic shapes. And the light that comes off of certain, say, hillside slopes or trees and this kind of thing will sometimes just be a general kind of texture, almost like a scumble of dry paint, right, on a paintbrush as it's lightly scrubbed over top of a canvas surface. And so we might start to do something a little bit like that. What else you might see in work like Ivan Earl's is actually trying to produce a semblance or a stylization of the texture of the rock or the grass or whatever, right? So we're free to do whatever we want. I might actually play around with a few different options there. For instance, the distant trees might be a tree brush that I use. And so we'll get into that here. So let's turn off our visual target, start to see kind of what we're dealing with here overall. So now it comes time to kind of plan how we're going to actually achieve this look layer by layer. And so for me, it might become a good idea for me to start to isolate the different planes of existence in the scene with groups, right? Just so I can keep it organized and start to really kind of play into how some of the texture's working from space to space to space. I'm going to turn the visual target off. What I'm going to start working with is the foreground here first, and then I'll slowly work into the background and start to apply some of the things that we see in our VTAR. And one of the things that I want to do at this point is actually get a group of brushes going where they have texture, and I can use those textures to paint and almost plan how the textures are going to be laid in here. So let's start a new layer, or yeah, we'll start a new layer. Why not? I'm just going to fill it with white. And this is just going to be a little practice canvas for us to discover what our different brushes can do. And so one of the brush sets that I have is from an artist called Greg Rutkowski. And I mean, you can find brushes anywhere, but I really like Greg's brushes. If I can find the head folder. So you can see there, Greg Rutkowski. I'll put that in the chat also. Did you DAO this environment, Brandon? Did I do this environment? The one that I'm working on currently? Yes, I did. Your own brushes. I'm in. If the question is, do I make my own brushes? Then yes, I do. Depending on what I need at the time. I do like to shop around for brushes, either free or paid. I mean, you can find a lot of really good brushes out there. Greg's, I think I did pay for, and these are other artists who have gone through development of whatever, right, in their work. And they've spent the time kind of finessing these brushes. So to save time for myself, and I'm really happy to support other artists with that kind of thing. But you'll find brushes out there that are free, right, as well. So you don't always have to pay for them, but I do. So there you go. So we can see. Let's grab actual pigment here. So I can kind of go through and start to see what the brush stroke will do for texture, right? When I'm laying this down, I can decide, is that something of a texture that I'd want to see anywhere in my piece? Would be something good for rock or maybe trees, right? This one, not so much. I mean, there's a lot of brushes in here. He actually has a really nice tree brush, which is convenient for us. Let's go try and find that bad boy. There's a nice cloud brush in here too, right? So you could kind of layer clouds. So this might be something that I actually do go and look at for my clouds once I start getting in there with some of the texture. Let's see what this one does. This one looks sort of like explosion or the condensed vapor clouds, right? Which is kind of cool. So saves us a ton of time on creating that believable texture, right? For us, it's maybe a bit realistic, right? I don't want we're dealing with something that's pretty stylized here. I don't want to start indicating like hyper realistic textures on top of these really generalized forms. For myself and the aesthetic that I'm thinking of, it's just maybe a bit too much, right? Too much of a juxtaposition. So yeah, it's okay. I mean, get into making your own brushes. It's really a case of trial and error. I think in the beginning, just to see what the mechanics are, right? We go through that in the intro course, is brush creation, just because you want that tool to be an option for you, right? So it's always good to kind of play around. But of course, there's so many out there that you can just download, right? So hello, Patrick. Okay, so let's go back to some of our playing around with these brushes in here. There's another cloud brush. It's maybe a bit spotty for me. Like, this is more of a generalized sort of chalk scumble texture, right? We get some of that noise in there. One of the things that we're seeing with the way this brush is laying that texture in is that if I cross back over top of the stroke, I do get that edge, right? So is that something that we want? Maybe, I don't know. I'm not in love with it. This is maybe something that I'll use for our clouds. So I'll remember to come back and look for that when we're ready. Let's go find the tree. So you can see sort of like the situation where we can, especially for us, we've got a lot of slopes with trees on them. I think the tree brush itself, this is an interesting brush in here. Interesting, but not the tree. Let's go find that. See a different brush in there. It's not really something I would look to use. Here we go. That's some trees. So this brush isn't bad. It can definitely give us a sense of trees overlapping with atmospheric perspective in between them. The harder I press, of course, the more that pigment's going to come through. And I could see myself using that maybe in this area down in here. I'd like my trees closer to us to be a bit more graphic. So I may develop a tree brush. I might just use the selection tool and actually go in there and kind of cut out my own trees. But yeah, I mean, in terms of us, let's just use the markup layer in there. If I were to use kind of a lighter color pigment, I can start kind of using that texture to indicate some of the trees in there and then have those slowly fall off in the distance. So that could be a really convincing effect for us at a distance. When we get close enough, I think the problem with this brush is that it looks too much like an actual tree, right? Likely it was sampled from an image of a tree. And then Greg would have likely just lightened up the base of the tree to help that feeling of that, you know, when we lay them down in layers, we get that atmospheric perspective look, right? So pretty fun way of working with that, but maybe we'll use that. Looking for other sort of textural scumble. So there's some interesting stuff maybe happening in here, right? Which could be, for instance, on this slope, let's grab a brighter yellow, right? And we'll go and just select that. I can start to kind of get this texture almost with lighting and make that feel like a chalk drawing almost, right? Just kind of blend that in a little bit. So it feels like there's noise like we would see with grass, but it's more of a traditional media quality noise rather than individual grass blades, right? So yeah, I mean, we could go through there and on the base level kind of work with some of these things. Let's go find these trees. Okay, those guys in there. I might rework these guys right away. So I'm going to kind of start to develop some of those shapes first. The lighting is going to be a little bit weird to start. I'm going to get back to the visual target later, right? But for us, I just want to still be setting up some of the detail work. We don't have too much of that in the middle ground to background. The foreground will be kind of more the place where we're going to have to do a bit more of that kind of work. Hyperreal is difficult. Photo bash, I do. We work through that in the advanced course because it's always good to have a good workflow for photo bashing because it can save you a ton of time. If you're working on a project where you don't have a lot of time and it is angling towards photoreal, just photo bashing things together can save you so much time, right? And so it's handy, but I come from a background of traditional painting. Mostly I don't do much of that anymore because my preferred media was oil. And it is so messy. I love it. It stinks. I love the smell, right? But my wife is not going to be so fond of that kind of thing. And the same thing with sculpting. Something like 3D sculpting is a lot easier to do, especially if you live in an apartment, right? Because traditional sculpting, even with something like Sculpey, it gets everywhere. It can also warp plastics and stuff like that, so it can damage countertops and flooring and stuff like that. So it's a bit of a pain. I miss it though. Like the tactility of traditional media is just, there's nothing like it. Certainly digital doesn't even come close for me, right? But here we are, commercial artists, right? Trying to make artwork with a minimal amount of mess, I suppose. Yeah, so photo bashing, good, but not my favorite thing in the world. Some people are amazing at it, and they love it, and those are the people that should be doing it, right? But doesn't mean we can't practice it. Okay, let's get rid of these trees. They're annoying me. I'm gonna get rid of all those guys in there. I kind of like what we have going on in these trees down below. So I'm gonna let those guys exist for a little bit at least. And got our pathway, our foreground trees. I'll probably build a few more foreground layers with those trees. And as we go back, we can layer those. Let's maybe start with the guys back here. So I'm just going to follow that curve that I've built and just have some of those trees pop up over top. A brush might be nice at this point, but I kind of want to have a little bit more control over what the treetops look like and how they kind of move through that space. And I'm just drawing with the marquee selection tool. I can be very targeted about where these treetops actually hit, and therefore my overlaps will be designed rather than kind of haphazard. Thinking about these guys, as they get further away, they're going to get small, right? So I don't want them to be too big. It's a good first pass. Let's use some of the scumble we got going on here. So I'll set up the shape, right? So we've got that kind of nice shape with all those little trees kind of sticking up out of there. It's on a separate layer, so if I ever let go of the selection, I can always use the select load selection transparency. And just to reiterate, for those of you that aren't familiar with that, you can go into select. So we're just dealing with the trees that I've actually painted on their own layer, right? And you can go into load selection. The default channel it will pick is just the transparency, right? Whatever's transparent, it won't select. Whatever is an actual pixel, it will select. So just on default, it will select that, and you can press OK, and then that everything that was painted before comes back as a selection. If you love that, you can always go in and save that selection and just reload it later, right? So just to go through that, let's do the let's go MG/FG tree line. We're kind of middle ground going into, or foreground going into the middle ground, or vice versa. Boom. All right. So if I needed it back, I could just go into select load, and it'll always default to transparency. So I'd have to click that for the drop down from my selection, and there you go. It's back. Yeah. Your photo bashing skills suck. Yeah, it does take practice though, right? So I mean, it's really the name of the game for art and artists is just infinite amounts of practice. Otherwise, you know, it's you're winging it, and maybe you'll get lucky, but I doubt it, right? So let's get some of the scumble texture in here. I'm just going to kind of rough that in just to start to kind of detect how that's going to look. Not too bad. with this, I feel like the base of the forest is going to be a bit darker, right? So I can go back to this mass in here, and I have my hotkey set up to Control G to select transparency, right? So Control G will pop that up and I get it right away. That's because I use that a lot, right? And that's the benefit of pretty much of any program is hotkeys. Is if you find yourself doing a certain thing all the time, set up a hotkey for it. That'll probably clash with an existing hotkey, but I mean, Photoshop does its best to set up hotkeys for what they think people will use the most, and sometimes that workflow is just not for you, right? So figure it out. Figure out what works well for you. We got that, so let's move it into a bit darker in there. Let's see if I can kind of just scumble up. So something about this brush that I'm actually seeing now is that the texture that has been mapped to this brush is actually tiling, and we can see that. And me no likey that, right? Because it starts to become obvious like that's a pattern. So the original texture that was sampled for this brush wasn't integrated very well, or it wasn't tiled very well, right? And to be honest, it's difficult to do that, especially if you're pulling just random photography, because say you're taking a picture of denim and you want to make that a texture. Well, there'll still be light hitting that denim on one side, maybe a little bit stronger than the other side. So that's sort of what we're seeing here is whatever that texture was, is it was lit stronger on one side, so it's lower contrast, the other side's darker, right? So we start to see that thing show up as a tile, right? Rather than it being, you know, invisible in its tiling. So good morning, afternoon, evening, good Thursday or Friday, depending on where you are in the world. Okay, so not in love with that. I'm going to back it up. Let's go try and find something better. To be honest, sometimes I just love making strokes in Photoshop. It's not very good for production, right? Me sitting here just messing around, but you know, when there's nothing kind of no schedule, sometimes it's like kids slapping their hands in paint and just making strokes and seeing what happens with it, right? There's a catharsis, I think, in that, in just kind of making art and with colors and strokes and lines and shapes, right? At least for me. I think you mentioned this before to me as a student. I actually don't know who you are because of your name, but I believe you. I've had quite a few students over the years, so yeah, unless it's your actual name, I might struggle a bit to know who you are, of course. Let's go see if we can find a bit of a nice scumble texture up in there. I kind of like that. Let's back it up. So this brush, I can tell, is kind of, you can see that it's jittering, right? As I throw that stroke, it's lightening and darkening, lightening and darkening. So we get this little bit of a banding that runs through there. Interesting. That might be something better for the rock, to be honest, than trees, right? I'm kind of looking for the noise of pine needles and whatnot. So let's see what this guy does when he's huge. That's kind of interesting. It sets initial direction and then keeps it. Oh no, it'll work with the pen tilt. That's kind of fun. I like to be able to control that a little bit with my pen stroke. And so I might just set up this texture at the base as a way of making some of the stroke energy look like it's moving out from the mountain itself. So it's about experimentation, right? Of course, you guys are always going to want to make sure that you're being as efficient as you can as a concept artist when you have an actual task. But sometimes it's just about kind of figuring out how the thing will look, right? So research and development. I mean, a lot of the times in concept art, the goal in pre-production is to have concept artists able to try and fail at ideas to see kind of what we should go for, right? The hilarious thing is that there's never enough time. So the pre-production that concept artists wish they had rarely exists on probably smaller projects because money is tighter. You know, at a Blizzard or a Naughty Dog, they're definitely going to make sure that they go through the due diligence of going through a proper pre-production, because that actually does help the quality by the end. If you have to one-off assets all the time because you have no time, there's a lot of derivative work that comes out of that, of course. And just like the single tear rolls down the concept artist eye. Yeah, it's a nice expressive brush, right? So it's pretty fun, at least as a base layer, right? Our trees look hilarious kind of sticking up out of there, but that's no worry. I could go and lock those guys up again. And, you know, I could even start painting into that if I wanted, right? To start to integrate that. The problem with this is it might start to feel a little bit like grass. But that's interesting because we could go and try that out on the foreground grass instead of using that base scumble. So let's hook that guy up and then see what a smaller representation of that might look like. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we could probably make that work. We can make the sweeps of grass as kind of graphic as some of the mountains, which could be cool, right? Instead of just having kind of this big naked slope, because it is our foreground element, and we might want to spend some time there, as it's going to be in the real world a place where we're going to see the most detail. Like if we see this in here, we get to see it kind of the rocks and whatnot that kind of span down the cliff face. So for me, maybe that could be something fun where we cross over to the other side, right? Maybe I get that pinching over there. And make that a tiny bit darker, a little bit more green blue. So maybe we can kind of just make this really nice grass vibe come through here. Do like some of these shapes though. One of the things we can do is we can go into the brush settings and we can turn on our color dynamics and have the foreground background jitter turn way up. Right now it's the jitter's not set to anything. It's set to 0. And so I can actually go in there now that I have that turned on. You'll see that it starts fluctuating between brown and green a lot. Well, that's your foreground color, right? It's selecting these two and jittering back and forth as I stroke. I can set that up on a control like pen pressure. So the harder I press, the more it happens, right? And then the percentage is how often that happens, like 30% of the 39% of the time or 100% of the time, right? So reminds me of the show We Bear Bears. I'll have to take your word on that. I'm not familiar. So if I wanted to do that, maybe I can pick something that's a little bit warmer yellow, right, than that green. So let's see what that looks like. So that's kind of nice because it's a subtle shift into those other colors. So I can come back in here and maybe make some of that a little bit more interesting that way. I can have this on and off. 39%. I might just turn that back off and then come and grab some of that grass in the front. I can turn that back up, right around 38. Have that kind of move through there. So that feels pretty good for now. Like we can always come back to this stuff, right? So let's move on to the pathway. I'm going to get a little bit of the texture going on in the path itself. So we have that flat point brush in there, so we can come back later and grab that one. Let's go and try and find something that's a chunky sort of textural thing. That's kind of nice in there. I'm going to lock the pixels. We can see that sort of in there. I could go and this one you can tell as well. It's bouncing between those lighter, darker values, right? So color dynamics, we have the brightness jittering here, right? You can see if I go into that control, it's clicked. I can go in and see what the artist has done. And you can see that the hue is jittering a little tiny bit. The saturation just minorly jittering, but that brightness is jittering quite a bit. That's why we see light and dark, right? So for me, that's not bad. Foreground, background, jittering. So I can come in here and start to select some of that stuff, go to our background, select something that's maybe a bit earthier, darker still, and then you would get something that looks like this, right? So that might be a nice way to set that up, at least in the meantime. Here's a texture. If it gets too uniform, of course, it's going to look like stones or bricks, more so than it's going to look like kind of something a little bit more textural and vague. So I can do something where I just go in and pop in some extra strokes to make that feel a lot different. Get smaller with it so that detail gets smaller as we move down that slope, and smaller still. Let's delete that. Get that noise down at the base there. Do the same thing for the other path, right? This guy. So this one, maybe I want something a little bit kind of muddier, stony, right? So let's do it. Let's go find something. Oil pastel might be pretty cool. Or not. I'm using the felt tip Cintiq nib. And these things, I guess I press so hard, these things get destroyed really fast. So I got to watch out. I'm pretty notorious for stabbing a pencil through the paper to draw. It's like, I don't know, my arm is heavy or I'm just kind of pent up or something, but definitely something I notice happens. I wonder if this one will be any good. I kind of like that. Let's lock the alpha. Let's see what kind of shapes we get out of that. Interesting, but I don't know if that's the right one for this. Let's see, oil pastel large. That one's not too bad. A little bit of a stony thing, but I'm kind of looking for something that's a bit more broken up. When you usually do a piece like this, how much do you plan out and how much is more spontaneous? I mean, it just depends on the piece. Sometimes you really have a sense of what you're going to go for, right? For us, for instance, we know that this is our reference point, right? So, I mean, here, there's the roadmap, right? But in terms of building the texture, that kind of thing, I'll play around. I'll respond to the texture that I'm putting in there. And if it doesn't feel good, then I'll change it, right? And so, you know, sometimes it's a trial and error, as I mentioned before, say with the brush creation. But then sometimes, you know, if I'm working for a client, it'll be very specific, right? And they'll need certain things, right? And so it's not like I have a ton of options for myself to make something look a certain way. So that'll be a little bit more contained. But yeah, I mean, it's as long as you have a vision for what you want to achieve, a lot of that relies on reference, experience, memory, right, of things, lighting, color, texture, you know, aesthetics in general, stylization level. And then you can kind of access those things. It's a lot of, say, for a junior artist, thinking that way. Like a junior artist can be somebody that has a lot of life experience, right, and is older, but they can also be somebody that's younger and doesn't have a lot of life experience. So the person that's younger without a lot of life experience isn't going to be able to draw mentally from a lot of things, so they're going to have to rely on a lot of reference at that point, right? Versus the person that's older, has more experience with some of the things, they might be able to draw on those memories a little bit more, unless they have a terrible memory at that point. Everybody's different, though, of course. Trying to find a good brush here. This one looks a bit scrappy. So we could change up the texture in that. It's not bad. It is respecting the direction of the brush as it lays down some of those marks, but I don't know. Don't know if I love it. Could be a combination of a few brushes, right? See what we can find in there. Let's try something a little bit darker. Almost kind of feels like little stones or shadows, I guess, of stones. I'm already starting to stutter. It's too early in the day for that. This one actually feels pretty good to me. I might kind of stick with this for now at least and move on. That's something else that, you know, I definitely make sure that I do. I don't get caught up in something if I'm not feeling it or something's just not working out. Because it's better that I have something that's not great but still planted, right, on the piece, and then I move on to those other things, right? So that we're not kind of hovering in one area for way too long. I'm gonna make this one really bright at this outside edge and have that come across just to give that volume to that space. I think try and find the spaces where the light would bounce off of some of these other shapes as well, right? So that works for now, I think. So let's go back to the trees now. So just let's take a look overall what's happening with this. Also kind of plant it in the space where You guys can actually see it around my camera window. So yeah, feeling not bad. So I'm gonna get back into. I'm just gonna use a airbrush to get some of the volume into this middle ground set. So I'll go all the way back up to the top and grab an airbrush, and I'm just gonna sample something a little bit darker and more saturated there. So even just doing that, right? Let's back it up. Adding the darker value will pop that lighter value for those obvious reasons of contrast, right? Strong contrast. So it becomes brighter even though we haven't changed that value because it's set up against something that is darker. All right, so it really draws our eye at that point. Let's go grab our trees. Actually, our trees will be fine. I was looking at these guys kind of not melding in with it so well, but they're fine. So I'm going to set up some other shapes in here and slowly kind of make them bigger as they kind of come towards us. So even within something like this, right, let's go and grab a normal brush so we can talk about how that's going to work. So we have this main shape. Let's make sure I'm not drawing anything. There we go. We have this main shape in here, right, which is kind of a nice flowing tapered shape. If I were to come in here and just put trees uniformly along that edge and then another set here, right, it will create a pattern for sure. But might I want there to be other rhythms within that overall shape, right? Like yeah, I mean, I might. If it's just ends up being a pattern of the same kind of tree and overlap as it moves over the edge, it makes it a very easily read form, but it doesn't add much interest beyond that, right? And that may be a goal of yours. You don't want to draw too much interest to one place. So yes, you're going to make it more uniform. For myself, I want to kind of think about, these trees on the edge are disappearing over the side, right? But I can have some tree stands kind of rise up in here, maybe smaller ones in here, and then larger ones kind of moving in through there, right? And just play with how those things are actually coming towards us. So that would be kind of my next step, is trying to sort out what those would be, right? I could even do something like I'm doing here where I'm actually I'm drawing a map of the way things will work. So for me though, I'm going to undo that and I'm going to get back into just doing it from a mental standpoint and not actually mapping it out. FG tree 2. So these are the ones that are going to be bigger. I'm going to use an airbrush and get some of that dark value underneath. We could get some of that light value up on top, right, just to see what those look like. Right, so that's kind of like a nice little rounded group. I'm going to set them up like this. I can get back in there with that scumbled texture later, right, because they're their own layer now, right? So start another one. FG tree 3. So that one's going to be on top of these, so I can have them kind of climbing up the slope. So let's do that. First of all, let's block those out. These all actually need to go underneath our path. So they have to sit there instead. There we go. Maybe a hand brighter on that guy. So we're starting to get a little bit of that sense of compression space that we would get with perspective, right? And building a sense of those trees kind of rolling down the hill. If we look at our reference, we see that that's actually the case. I mean, these are naturally growing trees, so of course they're going to be a bit different than, you know, our setup here. But that's sort of the idea of how I'm building it. So that's a good first step. I might have another grouping in here. Let's turn this guy off. I might kind of have another set that maybe pops up this way. So let's go back to that layer and pick some trees that are maybe the same size as those guys. See what those guys look like on top of each other. Is targeting as well, like where these trees are angled towards and what shapes they're making with positive and negative shapes, right? So that they look good together. We don't get tangents. Of course, we can change that whenever we want, but that's the goal, right? Is to avoid the tangents if we can. Big difference. Design notes on top of composition. Design notes on top of the composition. Yeah, I mean, I do leave a markup layer for that. You know, you could even tag it a certain color so you know that that's your markup layer, and make sure you're not actually accidentally painting on top of other artwork, right? So yeah, we're just getting those shapes in there now. We've got the middle ground. Again, those things are set up for us to fix if we don't like it later. I'm going to come in behind here now and maybe make one more layer to make it feel like it's progressing into the background a little bit more. So FG tree 4. So these guys are visible to us, so we can start to make choices on where the next set will go. As a nice overlap. Might extend some of these down into that lower section so we don't see them kind of just end in an odd way. And we can come here like this. That guy's got to go underneath the rest of those. Keeping it subtle, right? Deciding on where you want your contrast. If everything is the same quality, then of course it's going to get lost because it'll just be competing with everything else. So watch out for that, right? Tweakable, like we said, but it can go south on you pretty fast if you're not paying attention. These guys in the back there. I like some of, if we turn that off, I like some of this scumbled edge in there to just break it up. I'm happy to keep that because it does feel a little bit sort of, let's say chalk-like. In there though, I mean, I could elect to try and affect that edge, throw a mask on it, in my mask, go in and just kind of chew through there with the same sort of quality of angularity of the trees. And then just paint that out. All right, so if we turn our trees off again, you can see sort of the edge that I've created with that underlying mass in there. I might get rid of some of this stuff down in here. It's a little bit... Oh, that's a different layer. Aha. This layer's got some funkiness going on. I'm actually going to go in and erase that because those look like errors to me. In terms of some of this stroke coming through. This tree here is too transparent, this guy, so I need to isolate him again and make sure I paint solid pigment on top of that, so that he doesn't let that underlying layer through and make it look like a paper thin cardboard cutout or something. Find that back layer. Actually, I'm starting to get that there too. So my airbrush was just a little bit too soft. If it's just not working for you, which is what was happening there, I had my alpha lock on, and if it's transparent at all, it will lock the alpha, right? So if anything's transparent, it will lock that transparency. So it's good to just watch out for that stuff, right? Not feeling too bad. We're getting a little bit of an edge around some of those distant trees, though. So let's see if we can remedy that by just grabbing that. That feels not too bad. I'm actually just going to paint that down without any alpha lock or anything like that, just to continue those edges of those trees down into the tree line. We might just have a few more of these rhythms come through on this tree section in here. One of the things that I could start to point towards is almost like a tangent, although my students will know that tangents are bad. We have this kind of slope back here moving into this direction. So if we can kind of feed energy into that somehow, right? It might be useful to us. Now, I don't want to fade it into that space with me connecting the dots and creating a tangent, because then that's going to confuse the viewer's eye. But what I can do is swing some of those tree stands down into that space in a way. I would just need to figure out what a nice overlap would be. So I might have something kind of come in through here, right? Because we would have a stronger overlap in that connection point, and then I wouldn't be creating a tangent either there, there, or there, right? So this is sort of like a good place to plan for that. So I might start yet another tree stand layer, FG tree 6. And then let's get some of those trees kind of coming out of here. Let's see how that goes for us. Yeah, just like very softly kind of working its way down into that space in there. Feels not too bad. If it's too much for me, lock those pixels and knock it back by a hint. Not everything needs to be receiving the light the same way. Again, we can come back in later once we get to more of the lighting and tune it. But just setting it up in the meantime might be good for us here. I might actually come back into this layer. Have a few of these bigger trees disappear in here. See if that works for me anyway. Varying that a little bit. I can come in and kind of just plug in some trees here and there if I feel like there's little gaps that I want to fill. That might be enough for us. Yeah. One of the things we could do is we could start to add more of a deciduous tree than a coniferous tree, and that, leafy trees rather than trees with needles as a nice accent in there. Maybe that might be something that I would play with later. What it might look like, depending on the time of year. Let's go find one of these layers. So this layer here, FG D tree 01. So it could be that we kind of create a specific shape. Go and look at what deciduous tree you're kind of vibing towards, what that might look like. And then I could hit that with something that's maybe, if it were fall, right, we could get this tree coming in there and feeling like it's kind of popping out of there. So you'll get forests like that where we'll get conifers and deciduous trees together. The nice thing about the stylization is that we can simplify those forms and get them in there pretty fast. So that could be something we do. That might be interesting, just to spice up the hillside a little bit, so it's not just the sea of, say, pine trees or whatever they are. I'm going to add like a storytelling element to this, referencing a photo I took. Depends. Yeah, I mean, for me, the narrative would come from the VTAR, the light coming through here and casting a focal point on maybe a little house or a distant sort of chalet, right? Down in the valley. So that would be as narrative as I would get. A lot of people, when you're doing environment design, they have this desire to put people or storytelling elements into it. That comes from, I guess, a general sense of what an environment is. It isn't an environment until it has people wandering around in it, right? So, or creatures or that kind of thing. Certainly that would add an element of interest, but a lot of the times people won't focus on the environment as the character in a way, if that stuff happens. So you could go many ways with it. For me, I'm not going to focus on humans at all in this. I want it to be about the scene, as we see here, right? We do see that little house or whatever down in there, and we see there's a clearing, there's trees in the way. So I took that out, right? I wanted to see that down in there. And so, but it just depends on what you want, what your client wants, what kind of vibe you go for. All right, we'll see you later. Opera Bugs Bunny on a rock. Yeah, that could be it. Story with props. Yeah, the house is a prop, right? So, you're going to be speaking to, anything you do visually, you're indicating with information of a sort, right? So the way you organize that information will have an impact on whether or not people are understanding your story, for instance, or your narrative. If there's a big grand narrative, right, you'll definitely need the information in there to tell that story. So for us, the narrative is pretty minimal. We're looking and we're looking at kind of the majesty of a space, the interesting formation of a valley, the sweeping sort of rolling hills of that valley up high in the upper valleys into the lower valleys, right? And kind of the incline of all of it. It's very severe, right? That's when you go to a place like Switzerland, where this is, you start to notice that, or say, I'm sure the Himalayas, never been, the Rocky Mountains. I was born in the Rocky Mountains, so that stuff's pretty usual to me. I maybe take that for granted a little bit too much, but I still love it, right? So yeah, that can carry enough of the interest, as long as you do make it interesting. And so when we get back, let's turn the reference off. I'll turn the VTAR off as well. It's like these shapes are the movement through the piece, right? The textures and the generalizations of those things are the interesting part of this, especially with stylization. It's not real. It's not meant to be real, but it's referencing the real and simplifying it, exaggerating it, right? So a lot of the times that can be what's interesting about it. Yeah. But so at that point, like we've kind of roughed some of that stuff in. I would expect to kind of come in and work a lot more with the texture in these trees. But I do want to start to develop some of the other texture and potentially some of the lighting in these other areas. Might work next. Let's see. Maybe even this lower stand of trees in here, because we started to work with some of the rhythms of the trees and the way they're flowing through in the middle foreground. At certain points, I may opt for that to be a lot more kind of just patterned in certain areas, so I wouldn't steal the attention away. But this could also, this little stand in here could lead us into that cabin down below, chalet, whatever we want. Which we don't have yet. So it would be good to maybe get that going on, at least to rough it in, so that we know where we would point some of these energies, these sweeping shapes. So let's start a layer for that. River. I might actually put that house right on top of that river. Chalet. Red Deer. Love the episode of dogs. Where in Canada? I'm in Vancouver, but BC. Yeah, spent most of my life in the Alberta Rocky Mountains, so the very extreme ones, / BC. So a very, very big space with a lot of beautiful mountains. And Vancouver's really nice because you have the mountains running right up to the ocean, and then islands and stuff like that. So I am lucky to live in a place such as this. Okay. So we got our chalet in there. I feel like somewhere, I don't want to kind of get too invested in the shape, but I feel like if I have that just at the water's edge with an overlap, that might be something something to work with in there. Part of the reason I want to do that, let's grab a red. Is this sweeping direction into here kind of creates a nice arrow, which I can embellish to have us kind of pushing towards that. And as I sweep maybe in through this piece in here, right, I can have that direction of that sweep up into that shape. And even with some of the tree line stuff that I'm going to be doing in here, I could have that kind of connect into that space in there and have that look fairly interesting as it moves out towards the chalet. So I'll just mark it for now with that little shape, but that's sort of the idea. Overlap's really nice because then I know where that building is relative to the river, right? So have I been to New Westminster? Yes, I have. It's a suburb of Vancouver, or its own city, sure, but definitely suburb of Vancouver. Okay, so let's go and work with this guy in here. So those are one and the same, which is, I mean, that works. The overlap is not such that I would have to do a lot of tailor-made work if I'm dealing with patterns or anything. So I'll keep it that way. I am going to get rid of these little trees. They were more of kind of to indicate scale for me, and I don't need them right now. But I will leave that little kind of that edge in there. Or will I? I might opt to actually erase that. Take your alpha lock off, otherwise you'll just get white. The reason I'm doing that is some of the paint on that didn't come across totally transparent, or sorry, opaque. So I'm going to go in there with a selection tool, and I'm going to kind of make our little trees. Trying to make it a little bit varied so it doesn't feel too uniform. And then we'll just push that edge out. Yeah, feels pretty good to me. The lower part, I do want that to span up into that guy, so I'll have that come down this way and just quickly paint that in as a harder edge. I might have a few trees kind of come off of that cliffside. I could even get some cliff face coming out of that as well, which might be interesting. Maybe I'll try a little bit of that. So exposure of cliff, sort of like we have on the other side, and we do have up in here. So we get that coming through here. Maybe I'll use that to draw the viewer's eye to the house in here. Not fond of that shape. Sort of thinking of rock bluffs. It might be good to just kind of leave this without more detail, because I'm going to be reading a lot of the trees in the forward and middle ground. I might just opt for the grouping of trees down there. So at this point, I could go in and do a very similar thing as I did with the rest of these trees. I could make a brush at that point to save myself some time. Thinking about, am I going to have to do that for these other areas in here? I may have to, and it might save myself a little bit of time and keep things fairly consistent. So I might actually do that. File new. We'll go 25, 25, and then we'll start a new layer. And we will create a brush tip shape for a tree. So I might want that to be actually tapered more like a football. Not too worried about the base of it. My pen nib's starting to come apart. You still make concept art look really easy. I guess in a way I hope so. I've been doing it for long enough. It's habits, right? It's knowing things, it's remembering things that you've practiced or that you've paid attention to or observed. If you haven't done as much as me, then it's going to be harder, right? Because you're going to be second guessed. This is something I tell my students, and obviously if you've been my student, you know that. Novices and junior students are going to get kind of super tied up in, should this be the right move? What should I do? Doubt creeps in. Then you stop, kind of, sometimes that completely arrests you, right? And, that can sometimes just slow the whole process down. A lot of the times it will, right? For me, it's sort of, if I screw up, I think about how to fix it. And I go back through and I don't worry about that. Is this working at all, right? Because I've been through it enough times that I know it'll work out somehow. Maybe not perfectly, but it will work out. So I think that's the case for any artist or creative or of any sort. Like, say, a chef, right? They're going to be creating a new dish. They know more of how things work well together, right? And then they'll try those things out, and it might need a little bit more acid or sugar or salt, right? And cooking time or whatever it is, right? And then, they get there faster. Whereas, say, if I started trying to cook a dinner for people, it would be pure stress because I'm just not into that. My wife is a lot better at that stuff than me. Okay, so I kind of like the vibe of that tree we saw from Greg, right? With the fade down in the bottom of that tree. So I know to achieve that, it has to move towards white for me to not be able to see that. But of course, to lay in the opaque pigment, we need to be at black if it's going to be opaque. Anything other than black will be slightly translucent. So when I lay these trees on top of each other, they might start to feel like they're ghostly apparitions of a tree, right? So a good way to start this, and I've got it on a separate layer so I can affect that separate from the background, is I am going to use a black, and I'm going to start at the tip of my tree and just make sure that that's black. About halfway down, I can start to lay off of that a little bit. Maybe I'll go a little bit further than halfway down, right about here, and then I can kind of fade that off. Maybe I'll go with white just at the bottom so that we have something that does truly fade off in there. Okay, so we need to find a texture that's going to make our tree look super sexy at a distance, right? So we're thinking, if I'm making this for a distant tree, then I'm not going to be paying so much attention to individual branches and that kind of thing, but I want a similar noise. So if I'm kind of at this distance from it, that it feels good. Right. So let us go on a little bit of a journey. I'm going to check out Greg's brushes again just to see if I can get some texture out of it. So I can do this with another layer over top because it's only, as I output this brush, it's only going to respect sort of a flattened version of it. Read the black to white or the brightness, and then make that the alpha, right? So I could do something where I get the kind of branches coming out. That looks terrible. I'm looking for that noise. So let's skim through here. How are these guys looking? I don't mind that canvas look, but the application's not what I want. That's a pretty cool brush. I got to be careful when I'm doing this because sometimes, like I mentioned in the very beginning, I can get sidetracked and like, oh, that's a cool brush. Completely irrelevant to what I'm actually doing. Staying on task is key. Some chains down on the bottom. What does this breakup look like? That's kind of nice in and of itself. Because I'm thinking about, like, I'm imagining at a distance what that texture looks like, right? I have white selected, and when I paint with this brush, we see that there's value. So what do we know about that, right? We know that we come into here, color dynamics, we're going to get a brightness jitter, right? That means it's saying, yeah, you picked white, but it's going to jitter into other darkness or other brightness values. So if I didn't want that, I just turn that off. I can turn all of that stuff off. I can just turn color dynamics off, right? And then it'll go back to white in there. So I can maybe make that bigger and come through here and have this just be this kind of scratchy thing. One of the nice things about this specific brush at that distance might be that we have a lot of kind of straight lines in there. So we might speak to the sticks and branches of this guy, right? Or the straight and pine needly feel. I could go back the other way. So I can press my Control G and just select the transparent stuff on there and then come back to this upper layer. Whoops. And then paint those stick elements coming out of it, right? Which might be nice. Got you a gig with Blizzard. Nice. What do you do with them? Let's get this going in here. Let's try it out. Let's see what that feels like at least. Maybe I'll actually get some of the darker stuff coming down into the bottom. That's just a nice texture. Freelancing game levels, nice work. You'll definitely have to send the work whenever you're able to the school when it's published, so we can see what you worked on. That'd be awesome. So I'm just gonna go back to selecting this guy. Yeah, that feels pretty good. Maybe I'll break up the top of this tree just a hint more. See how that guy works. So we would go into maybe not. Let me just get some more white in there. It feels a little bit weird that we're not getting any sort of breakup on those edges down in the gray. Let's just kind of mess that up. Sure. Characters with Avalanche as well. Nice. Nice work. Congrats. That's where you're going to do a lot of the learning, is when you have to do it day in, day out, and you get critiqued by people who are not as even lenient as I was, if you would call me lenient. File, let's go edit, define brush preset, tree start. This is going to change. Obviously, I have to go in and mess with the brush settings to see how it works, right? So let's get rid of this and use that layer. So we'll go into the tip shape and space this bad boy out. So when I come back to the other piece and I start painting with this, I'll have the ability to go and change the shape dynamics and scattering and whatnot while I'm painting. Excuse me. But I want to set it up so it's going to be the general kind of gist of the stroke that I want in the meantime, and those subtle tweaks can happen as I go. Excuse me. Took you by surprise. Yeah, I mean, it's also feels really good when you get your first gig in the industry. The wide eyes that you have that you have for working on projects, and like I remember back then how excited I was. Not to say that I'm not excited now, but you definitely settle into the career, right? The day-to-day of it. So it's always cool to hear when people are excited about getting into it. All right. So let's try this guy out. Let's just see what he looks like. Just flat black color. So not bad. My flow doesn't really matter. My opacity does. Whoops. There we go. So that'll be it. Not too bad, but we do maybe see a little bit of a lack of opacity in there. I think it'll be okay for our purposes, though. So what does he look like when he's small? Right. Yeah, pretty good. Pretty good. So, I mean, this is very uniform, of course. I have to make some changes to it. So we'll go into our angle jitter, and we'll have some of these tree tops flattened a little bit, right? And the X jitter is good because it'll actually flip the texture as it's starting to jitter the angle, right? So that's a good one. Size variation is also good, just so that not everything is perfectly the same. Roundness jitter will squash things, and so that can be, something that you want to do if you make, some of these guys a lot more stout. We could also squash it here, right? But that'll be fine there. We could get into scattering, maybe minimum diameter. No, that's fine. Scatter in here, pushing them apart by a little bit. Count. I wouldn't want to mess with the count right now. That's something that maybe as I go, I can mess with. I mean, that might be something a bit better for this brush. If we go back here and create another one, just by grabbing this and spinning it. All right, if I create a brush from there, edit, where am I here? Ah, well, I couldn't see it. There we go. Brush preset. We'll say tree, true tree. Space that out. So now I can actually squish this tree this way and I can angle it upwards, right? Now I can go into my dynamics and I can have the roundness squish out a little bit more, right? And we can get those variations in the tree like so. And so if I make this a bit smaller, right, we can get these guys feeling, if I built up a bunch of them, they would start to, we'd get some skinny trees and some fat trees in there, right? So that might be really nice for us as we're populating the group, depending on like how much of that roundness you want to jitter. Spacing scale of that might be a bit bigger, right? The spacing's a little bit too far apart. So that's feeling a bit better for me. Go back into the scatter. I can raise and lower a little bit so they're not kind of traveling on an even line, right? Back to shape dynamics, change the angle jitter by a hint. We got that roundness jitter really going on for us. So that feels not too bad. Not too bad in there for me. So let's go and apply the, well, first of all, let me pump the brakes. When you've done all that work, you need to hit the create new brush button so that it respects all of those settings that you want, because it allows you now to include the tool settings, right? So true tree, 610. I don't need the brush size in there. Let's go tree style 01. Okay, so there we go. We've got her. And then we can go back to our other piece and maybe start trying to lay some of this in a little bit. So let's go find that layer. Okay, that's where that is. So for me, maybe I'm going to capture a little bit of the highlight from the sky. So I'm going to grab that color and undo that. Grab that color and make it a little bit lighter, a bit more green. See what that looks like. So that's pretty good. Make it smaller so it fits some of these tree shapes in here. And I can kind of come in here and brush into that. I can set up in the shape dynamics. I can set this to direction. So as I paint with direction set, I can have that kind of follow my brush. So like if I wanted trees along this cliff edge, right, it will follow my initial stroke, right? So you do have to stroke from left to right. If I stroke from right to left, it'll flip the tree upside down. So let's just back that up. So now we've got this coming in here. I can have these kind of shapes appear, right? Kind of come in there and create these interesting little forms. So, I mean, right now this is looking a lot like a pattern. So, you know, use your judgment on that. Avalanche extension, nice. Spread my wings, but I'll get there. I really jumped into the deep end when you started. Well, I mean, that's, I think, one of the benefits of the program is that, we allow for, especially now with the intro course, allow for people that are a bit more novice to get into it. It does require a ton of work on the student's end, of course, right, as everything should, to make sure that you're doing the due diligence of practicing and whatnot. So, but yeah, I mean, it allows everybody to try it out and learn about what's expected in the industry and practice it, right? So glad you had a good time learning, at least. So with these guys, I don't know. I think I'm going to play a little bit with how this might work. I might kind of really amp up the size. Jitter. It might be nice to kind of almost have this be like a skirt of these trees as a texture, just to mix that up. Just gonna kind of come back in here and blot a little bit of that out. All right. So something I'm kind of not loving about this brush, to be honest, is that it doesn't fade off fast enough. And that's because, by the bottom half of this, the pigment's hanging on too much. So if I did want to change that up, let's get rid of that layer. I could create the brush again. Excuse me, create the brush again. Pop up to the top here. Grab this one, and then just have that fade off a lot more, right, by the bottom of this. So, and just look at the thumbnail of that just to see sort of what that might feel like as we do that. So let's just quickly do that again. I can go back into my brush palette here and go and delete all the extra brushes. It's not a huge deal. So let's quickly try that one out. Tree, true, 2. Name it whatever you want. Okay. We go in real quick, space that out, tilt that up, squash that a little bit. Or, you can go into your shape dynamics and have that roundness be something that's tweaked quite a bit. Try that out in here again. So that's maybe a little bit better. Change that spacing, see what that looks like. Yeah, that might be a bit better for us. And then I can name that tree true. We got it. And then I can keep tweaking that, add more brushes, tweak it again, save it again, depending on what I want. Name it the larch. Sure. I'll do that. I'll do that later. Learning stuff to use, but at least it's keeping me busy and giving me something new to look at. Yeah, it's always good to even just stay creative, right? I think the worst thing that happens, to me at least, is You get sidetracked or distracted with life stuff, and you don't get to the art as much, and then you kind of just feel, I don't know, I feel that longing, I guess, of wanting to do more artwork than I am doing. I mean, I have a lot of responsibilities other than artwork, school and whatnot, but it's always good to stay busy with that stuff. So I kind of almost like the way this is happening in here as well. And just the shadow of that side of the mountain coming in, those trees poking up through it. Be a few sparse ones in there. That's kind of nice. Down below, I can start another layer, maybe. Oops. Down below this guy. Where did he go? Start a new layer there and pop it up to the top. I can have some of these trees just populating the base, right? It might be nice to actually have some of these break through. If we look at the reference, we actually, I mean, obviously in this forest, you're going to see that happen more often, right? There's a few of these guys popping out, but I still want to maintain the overall look of those really sharp edges, right? So here and there, I might kind of break some of those out, scatter them almost like they're spilling out of the container of the tree stand. So yeah, I mean, that's something we could do. We could even potentially get some smaller alpine ones up top here, right? But that brush is made now. I have that brush, so I can tweak it and create whatever I need to create in that regard in that space. So I just feel like just a couple of these guys down in here might be nice to make that feel right, just like it's sticking out there. Yeah, and I mean, even locking that cliff in there and then grabbing a texture that maybe sits on top of that. I'm actually going to use a linear dodge. See if I can make that feel any different in there. That's a possibility as well. I dig it. So this would be one where, you know, I can create a clipping layer on top of that and get that that layer to be a dodge, go for the dodge there, and have that kind of filter in over top. Come back and erase into that. I'd have to turn my linear dodge layer off, but I can kind of poke those trees up through there and start to maybe create this really nice gradient as it flows over the top of that hillside. That might look nice. That might look really nice. And then what I'd probably be doing at this point is setting up the way the rest of these tree stands should look, in the way that they're receiving light and the way they're casting shadow or form shadow on the main mass. So, you know, as you start to work into that, just be cognizant of, you know, you want to start to set up a language, a visual language, especially with stylization, that's the way trees look at that distance. You don't want to cross over the valley and then have a different representation. I mean, you could, but there's going to be a distinct difference at that point. And as long as you're okay with that, that difference, then we're golden, right? So yeah, I mean, like for us, we'll be working into those other spaces in a very similar way. We've dealt mostly, we got a bit of grass, a little bit of the pathway, these trees here, that main kind of mass down into the valley. But we can start to kind of think about if we're going to add texture to the grass in the valley basin, the rocks, those distant areas, certainly the clouds, we will. And then we can start to add some of that that texture on top, or sorry, the visual target lighting on top of that, right? To start to kind of tweak those things. So, but we need to kind of get to this point first before we start maybe playing with some of the colorization / contrast shifts as we push towards our VTAR. Okay, but we'll have to wrap it up there for today. That time went pretty fast. But try this stuff on your own. Maybe try a stylized piece to see what you can do and what choices you would make. For instance, look at reference from like Ivan Earl and similar artists where they're really stylizing environment spaces, and also just working with environments, especially if you're not keen on environments, it can help you become keen, right? It's usually just the experience with it that people lack, and so they stay away from it because characters are easier to draw, right? So the due diligence, right? So yeah, I'm gonna wrap it up there. Thank you all for coming, and we'll be hitting up some life drawing on Monday as well. This next Monday, we'll be looking at warming up again. We might kind of take some of our warm-up practice and apply it to some interesting kind of doodles, or just in a way that we're angling towards a reason for doing the life drawing and creating some motivation for it. So I might see you guys then. Otherwise, keep up the practice, and we'll see you next time. Take care, gang.